Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Chapter 6 of The African Personality in America by Kobe Cambone. Chapter 6 starts with a quote from Dr. Bobby E. Wright. He said, "The only contradiction among Africans in America is that there are no contradictions." Can you imagine that? That there are no contradictions? There's nothing that is opposite to what it appears to be? I'll be right back.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Forecast. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Chapter 6, African Personality and African Mental Health. The rising incidence of mental health disorder and mental illness among Africans in America is reportedly reaching alarmingly high rates, especially among the adolescents and young adult populations. That's because they're under white supremacy and everything they see is white. Every powerful image that they have is a white person, and every black image that they see is an over-sexualized male or female. So we have to cleanse those images that they see. So-called neurotic or anxiety and psychotic reactions, drug addiction and abuse, suicidal behavior, deviant sexual behavior, general emotional stress, and violent and criminal behaviors are all reportedly on the rise among the African populations in North America. So it appears. These trends must also be considered in view of the sociopolitical plight of African people throughout the world, and especially in Africa and the Americas, which have clear psychological and mental health implications. In particular, Africans are being oppressed by Europeans throughout the world. They are almost totally economically dependent upon Europeans for life support resources in the world, and are also almost totally controlled by Europeans. Most African people lack true racial cultural consciousness. Our so-called educated people are intellectually incarcerated by Eurocentric cultural definitions, values, attitudes, and visions of the world, and our leadership as well is merely imitative of the European survival thrust. What does that mean? That means that our thinkers are locked up in ivory towers because they need a paycheck, and our so-called leaders or misleaders or the boule or whatever you want to call them are out there, and they see the world with they are black people, they are white people in blackface. Despite this tragic condition of being practically on the brink of self-destruction as a racial cultural group, most African people seem unconcerned, if not totally unconscious of it, unalarmed and quite comfortable, relatively speaking, with this insidious form of collective pathology, or what has been called menticide, the virtual depletion of the cultural mentality of a people. Menticide. These latter forms of pathological behaviors among African people are just as dysfunctional and disordered as are the former, more conventional forms mentioned above. Both forms clearly epitomize just how potent a psychological force Eurocentric cultural oppression of Africans has become in almost totally destroying the affirmative psychological adaptiveness and resiliency of African people. So their work to destroy us mentally is almost done. They also illustrate how far African behaviors, again, particularly in North America, have departed from the normal, healthy realm of functioning without any widespread recognition of this dangerous state of mental health affairs. When the concept of abnormal or disordered behavior is extended to incorporate those behaviors that pose a basic threat to the survival of African people, then the true prevalence of disorder and abnormality in African behavior becomes clearer. The Afrocentric paradigm for African personality has enabled us to begin to realize the importance of broadening the context of African mental health to encompass those social, political, behavioral patterns that have direct implications for the survival and affirmation of African community. The model of the African personality being articulated herein allows us to explain not only the psychological forces that define African mental health in America, but also the sociocultural forces that account for such a dangerous, aberrant condition as is the current state of African psychological affairs throughout the world. African self-consciousness and African mental health. As was noted in chapters 3 and 5, there are circumstances which can and do interfere with or mitigate the normal functioning of the African personality. These circumstances, where they do occur, are usually sociocultural in nature. In other words, such mitigating circumstances typically occur in a sociocultural context whereby the African personality, its psychical personality, is superimposed upon by an alien and anti-African reality structure, which is where most Africans in North America are. In such an unnatural psychological or reality context for the African personality, its conscious level functioning in particular becomes subject to weakening and distortion from the superimposed influence of the alien anti-African cultural environment. This is especially true where all of the institutional systemic supports are controlled by alien anti-African reality structure. Given the importance of ASC to defining and directing the African survival thrust at the conscious level, in other words, in actualizing the African survival thrust potential for the African personality, as was noted in Chapter 3, the vital importance of the relationship between this central structure and the phenomenon of African mental health becomes readily apparent. Whenever the condition or of disorder within the African personality occurs, it occurs at the level of ASC, not at the deeply rooted, unconscious, and the genetically determined level of ASEO. As was noted earlier, where socialization and or experiential and institutional support systems and processes, in other words, significant others in the form of persons or institutional processes, are influenced and dominated by an alien or anti-African European worldview system, then the African self-consciousness is vulnerable to substantial weakening and distortion by the alien influence. This is the circumstance of most Africans throughout the Americas today, and probably throughout the world. In fact, to the extent that the alien processes are indeed anti-African, as is the case of the European worldview, then the nature of the distorting and weakening influences resulting in African personality disorder become anti-African and self-destructive as well. So being in a system that is Eurocentric makes you anti-African and self-destructive as well. Under such conditions of disorder, the natural African survival thrust of ASC becomes distorted into an alien survival thrust, an alien self-consciousness, which is self-destructive to the African personality. The condition of disorder therefore alters the dynamic, holistic, or organismic, organismic structure of the African personality from a congruent and undifferentiated system to one representing fragmentation. So you are in a situation where you are altered by this process of being under European domination and supremacy. African personality from a congruent and undifferentiated system to one representing fragmentation, contradictory motives, and antagonistic conflictual energies. Recalling from a chart earlier published in the book, the rearranged or reordered dynamic structure of African personality in America, especially under conditions of disorder, is illustrated in this figure coming up. As can be seen in figure 6, which is a series of boxes, some of the first 3 boxes have dotted lines, the 3 under them have solid lines, and they all lead to contradiction, distortion in African survival. The broken lines indicate the unnatural weakening in the unity of functioning between the ASC and the ASEO. And those include distortion in African self-consciousness or alien self-consciousness, distortion in basic traits or alien traits, and anti-African survival tendencies. All 3 of those things lead to a breakdown in the Afrocentric integrity of the African personality system. Hence, the integrity of the normal personality system and natural relationship of unity and synergistic functioning of the ASC and the ASEO has been breached, such that they now reflect a basic differentiation and congruence. What is depicted then is that the African personality system has become dominated at the conscious level of functioning by such basic dispositions of European survival thrusts, such as individualism, materialism, aggression, and violence. Basic acceptance of European white supremacy and African inferiority doctrines and practices, a generalized anti-Africanness, and a basic disrespect of African life. In short, under conditions of basic disorder in African personality, the natural African survival thrust of ASC becomes distorted into an anti African, self destructive, alien survival thrust. So you want the white man to survive more than you survive because you have taken on all the traits and characteristics of the European. Psychological cultural misorientation in African mental health. Thus, this model argues that in American society, the European worldview system has achieved dominance over African people's natural worldview orientation through the arrangement of institutionalized socialization and social indoctrination processes to be discussed later. This situation of European psychological and cultural oppression of the African personality creates a psychopathological condition of distortion in ASC, which in turn creates disunity and conflict in otherwise synergistic functioning of ASC and ASEO. I have labeled this condition of African psychopathology misorientation or psychological cultural misorientation. While this condition is psychological in nature and therefore is certainly appropriately called psychological misorientation in terms of its content, it is at the same time meaningfully interpreted in terms of social cultural reality. Thus, in terms of its cultural reality meaningfulness, it can also be called cultural misorientation, which is a book we read here at my channel a couple of weeks ago. Check out the playlist. This is a condition of basic incorrect cultural psychological orientation in African people in which a pseudo-European or Eurocentric self-consciousness comes to dominate the natural ASC of the African personality. So again, you have black skin, but you're white on the inside. It is a condition of contradiction between the natural, unconscious, and conscious functioning and behavior of the African personality. The obvious form of the contradiction is that it represents an African person functioning Eurocentrically or according to the European survival thrust. In other words, an African displaying anti-African Eurocentric functioning and behavior. Such Africans, for all practical purposes, then, think, feel, and act like Europeans. They operate according to the European survival thrust. They are defined as normal and healthy by the European worldview because this worldview defines and reinforces only the European survival thrust. Culturally misoriented Africans do not, by and large, experience any unusual anxiety or confusion within the parameters of a Eurocentric consciousness over their sense of identity or their functioning, because Eurocentric societal systems fosters this psychopathological condition among Africans. Psychological cultural misorientation, therefore, refers to a grossly psychopathological condition occurring only in Africans, which masquerades as a functional normalcy within the framework of the alien Eurocentric social system. So basically, you have integrated into whiteness, but you're black. So you can never integrate into whiteness, and you don't understand that. So you think about things the way that a European would. This is the Uncle Ruckus. This is the ball player. This is a number of characters in our community that perceive themselves as having transcended blackness and having assimilated or integrated into whiteness. Simply stated, the Eurocentric institutional arrangement of American society socializes, indoctrinates, supports, and reinforces psychological cultural misorientation in African people. This model of African mental health, based on the ASEO and ASC paradigm, provides quite a different framework for conceptualizing and understanding this phenomenon. It is grounded in the African axiom of Ma'at, as discussed earlier, the core of African cosmology itself. Normality in African personality, then, is to strive for organismic survival maintenance through authenticity in African self-expression, transformation, and actualization of the Africanity, Asili. Thus, psychical, spiritual, harmony, balance, congruence, organismic, actualization, based on African cosmology, defines the parameters of normality, naturalness, and African personality. Some psychologists have referred to psychological cultural misorientation as basic African American mental disorder, meaning that it is the primary condition of psychopathology from which all other forms arise. Others argue that then the psychological cultural misorientation lies at the root or core of all conditions of African psychopathology. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. In general, this model allows for a new conceptualization and understanding of the psychological distortions and pathologies that are so prevalent in African behavior today. Whether one observes our more blatant or demonstrative so-called inner-city ghetto housing project street life manifestations of African mental disorders, like drugs, crime, and all forms of physical violence and self-destruction so prevalent in our communities, or whether one observes the more subtle, disguised, and socially acceptable or socially approved forms of Eurocentric speaking, like our obsession with curling and straightening our hair, or our uncompromising total commitment to the racial integration, cultural assimilation approach to not only human rights strategy, but in our personal, individual, social expressions as well. African mental disorder is also manifested in our uncompromising commitment to Eurocentric defined and controlled ideas, definitions of reality, knowledge, history, cultural values, rituals, and customs in all aspects of our lives, both practical and intellectual aspects. This includes, for example, our acceptance as non-contradictory of Europeans or other non-African names and self-definition rituals and customs, their child rearing, marriage, and family practices, their educational, religious, economic, political governance, aesthetic, recreation, and entertainment practices, and even their systems of deviance and pathology. So basically, we co-opt in attempts to integrate into their society their good habits and their bad habits. The very insightful observations of psychopathology in African behavior that have been made by many of our early and contemporary social analysts like W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Frantz Fanon, E. Franklin Frazier, Nathan Hare, J. Sofala, as well as many other astute and insightful novelists, confirm the existence, prevalence, and the danger of psychological cultural misorientation throughout the African community. Two brilliant psychologists, Naim Akbar and Daoudi Azaibo, have provided some excellent examples of the application of this paradigm to our establishing our own African self-centered classification system of mental disorders. Akbar, for example, proposed a classification system including 3 classes of African-centered mental disorders relating directly to the ASEO and ASC paradigm of African personality. These are the alien self disorders, the anti-self disorders, and the self-destructive disorders. The alien self disorders. These disorders are represented by Africans who have, at the conscious level, become alienated from their natural African orientation, Mayan ethnic and spirituality, through their internalization of the European worldview. Their behaviors reflect the blatant rejection of their natural African dispositions. They are oriented toward materialistic goals. They see themselves as material and evaluate their worth according to their physical makeup and the prevalence of material accumulations. Such persons are then preoccupied with materialistic values, social affluence, and rational priorities to the exclusion of moral imperatives. They deny the realities of race, racism, and European supremacy oppression and strive to emulate those behaviors, reinforcing the European worldview. They have therefore become completely alien to their natural African self-consciousness. Can you think of anyone who's materialistic in that way? I say that all of our celebrities, all of our sports characters, there are neighbors and coworkers that we have. There are people in our personal lives that can relate to this materialistic perspective where they have internalized the European worldview and they have turned their backs on their African-centered self. The anti-self disorders. These are African American behaviors which not only manifest similar characteristics to the alien self disorders, but also contain the added ingredient of hostility, covert and overt, toward Africanity and all things related to it. Africans who are afflicted with this class of disorders have internalized the European worldview to the point where they project negativism and hostility toward Africanity, in other words, toward themselves, personal and extended. They may even reach the apex of self-rejection by choosing marriage partners from the alien group. In other words, they select Europeans as mates. In Akbar's worldview, the anti-self disorders represents a more severe class than the alien self disorders because they are more out of touch with their natural ASC. I think that they represent a more severe perspective of the anti-self disorders because they are procreating with the alien in an attempt to destroy themselves. I think that there are some Africans that have so much internalized hate and rage toward themselves that they only want to procreate with a non-African woman because they want to destroy themselves subconsciously. Anthony McPhail says, I don't want to hear that Black-ish. I'm about green power. You got to be joking. That's not Anthony McPhail. That's what them Black people that have these disorders say. They don't want to hear that Black stuff. They about green power when in fact, when the reality of the situation is that no matter how much money you have, you cannot transcend your Blackness. You are not in a position or in a world where white supremacy or whites attempt at exerting their supremacy do not come up in your everyday life. Thirdly, the self-destructive disorders. This class of disorder refers to African behaviors which present faulty and destructive attempts to cope with the unnatural condition of white European supremacy domination. Unlike the other two categories of African mental disorders, these behaviors simply reflect the condition of being overwhelmed. So they are overwhelmed by white supremacy when they become destructive. They are at their core neither necessarily anti-African nor fully alien to Africanity. They more so represent direct victimized states reflecting the vicious condition of survival at any cost mentality, obscurely defined in personally destructive terms. In their struggle to survive white supremacy domination, Africans afflicted with this class of disorders can represent the deteriorated condition of so-called jungle parasitic and dog-eat-dog type of orientation. Such persons have, like the other disorders, obviously lost touch with basic aspects of their natural African self-consciousness. So as you can see, there's a scale, even for Akbar, when it comes to these anti-African behaviors, the alien self, the self-destructive self, and the anti-self self. All of them lead to self-destruction, though, because ultimately, if you're trying to survive this experience with white supremacy, domination, and oppression, then you become, when you are not grounded in a community that supports you, you become self-destructive because you don't see any other options. Azibo has contributed to this analysis by proposing a full-fledged African-centered nosology system related to African mental disorders based directly on the ASEO and ASC paradigm. In addition to incorporating Akbar's classifications, he proposes a number of additional classifications that are distinct to Africans, such as materialistic depression, oppression burnout disorders, theological misorientation, and menticide, to mention a few. Azibo also proposes, as noted earlier, that the psychological cultural misorientation represents basic African mental disorder and as such serves as the foundation or the initial condition of African psychopathology from which all other forms derive. Azibo and Akbar's classifications of African mental disorders reflecting basic distortions in ASC development and functioning are, therefore, clear examples of the basic disordered condition of psychological cultural misorientation. I have proposed at least 3 classes or levels of psychological cultural misorientation based on degree or amount of the condition present. In other words, psychological cultural misorientation can range from a minimum degree of affliction to a moderate or even severe degree of affliction. While the theory holds that virtually all Africans in America and throughout the diaspora have been afflicted with this basic disorder, it has affected us individually in varying degrees. Some of us minimally, fortunately. Most of us, however, have been moderately affected, and unfortunately, some of us have even been severely affected to the point of menticide. Some illustrations of fundamental psychological cultural misorientation among Africans in America, such as the Black Anglo-Saxons, as Anthony McPhail has highlighted. Certainly, the reader can readily think of numerous illustrations of this condition of the African personality from everyday experiences. I will present a few instances of what I consider to represent fundamental forms of psychological cultural misorientation in order to help crystallize the applicability of the model to our real life experiences. One of the more vivid examples of this phenomenon is the situation occurring not too long ago where an African in America accepted employment as a lobbyist in the United States Congress representing the so called South African government. This case surely needs no further explanation, even for the rather naive observer. Another more blatant extreme example would be the act of undergoing a facelift, in other words, major cosmetic plastic surgery by several of our well-known, world-renowned African entertainers in order to reflect more European-like facial features and complexions. We also find this general group of Africans constantly parading throughout the public news media with European spouses, dates, and intimates, and so called mulatto offsprings, and their Eurocentric social circles and activities. All of this African psychopathology occurs without them losing 1 ounce of popularity or respect in the African community. But they should, because if you decide to procreate with a non African person, you cannot be a leader in the African community. Notwithstanding these clearly mentally deranged national role models for the African community, what is probably even more dangerous, or at least just as dangerous, are the more pervasive and subtle everyday forms of moderate to severe psychological cultural misorientation that most Africans manifest on a daily basis. For example, I am thoroughly convinced that there is a powerful pathological dimension to Africans' approach to so-called hair grooming under the culturally misoriented conditions of white supremacy domination. In this regard, we are constantly trying to make our hair approximate to what we believe to be a Eurocentric look. So we perm our hair, we press our hair, we put wigs on, we buy their hair. Our African women have, from at least since the classic plantation era, been undergoing the torturous, self-depreciating ritual of literally cooking their natural African hair to get the highly sought-after European look of straightness or looping wavy curls. This begins as a self-depreciating childhood ritual and usually continues throughout their lives, even when many of us begin to display Afrocentric revolutionary-like and or mentally liberated-like behaviors, and may even attempt, often courageously, to directly take on the opposition of white supremacy domination. So even the pro-Black women still go back to wearing wearing wigs, period, right? They don't cut off the Eurocentric aspects of their hair because they want that straight hair. They want that good hair, right? They don't take it into account that even though they're saying the pro-Black things, that they look foolish because they wearing wigs and got blonde hair and they haven't decided to take on and wear a natural hairstyle. We obviously obsessively hold on to a view of personal, self-depreciating, Eurocentric exceptions or contradictions in our newly transformed selves, which we religiously reserve the right to maintain. This is true for most of us, even in the progressive Pan-Africanist nationalist community as well. While most of the prominent male entertainers and other popular personalities, such as the hip cats on the streets and among the African ministry, clergy, and among others in our community, have for a long time exhibited the straightened hair look, the general population of African men in larger and larger numbers are now following our women into these African self depreciation chambers that we call hair and beauty salons. And should it be called a beauty salon? Because no other group calls it a beauty salon. It's not where beauty is not something that you go pick up. Beauty is something that you have and you carry with you. Our hair is good hair, says Forecast. We don't have that dog type of hair. Exactly. Thus, most of our top male entertainers, their younger proteges and aspirants, and the so-called inner city brothers on the streets now have been joined in their pursuit of this overt, ritualistic manifestation of African self-depreciation by the so-called average Joe brothers. In fact, so-called working and middle-class African parents and their children are now popular promoters of the burnt hair styles. He's talking about perms. He's talking about permed hair because it literally burns your hair off. Even Malcolm X had a perm back in the day before he went to jail when he was Malcolm Little. This latest form of the European burnt hair look is called the Jerry curl. It comes in a variety of lengths, from the mild relaxer, lightly waved, cooked hair look with greasy Jerry curl look to the out-and-out looping curl and straight hair looks, the severely cooked hair look. The great cost in valuable productive human time and African creativity devoted to this severe form of psychological misorientation is enormous. Nor should we overlook the fact that the monetary cost for this most common form of African inferiority expression is steadily increasing. Attend any African church service on a Sunday, and a mere cursory visual survey or examination of heads alone will confirm the widespread prevalence of this dangerous self-destructive trend. And we haven't even mentioned the negative effects of hair burning on the optimal functioning of the saturation of the powerful melanin molecule throughout one's hair, thus disfiguring our African physical features in order to achieve the European Caucasian look, and by implication, greater self-acceptance under a social system of white supremacy domination, has now become so common among Africans in America that this gross form of mental disorder is literally taken for granted throughout the community. We Africans virtually take for granted that the normal way to groom African hair is to burn it, straighten it, or curl it. Or for the African face and complexion is to lighten it. Or our clothing and dress is to Europeanize it, as opposed to celebrating our rich and beautiful heritage by wearing traditional African styles and materials. It is also not uncommon to hear negative and disparaging hair and physical characteristics references made about African children, even within their own homes, mostly in their own homes and family circles. Naturally, our male-female relationships, we too often consciously and unconsciously project Eurocentric imagery onto each other as standards of acceptance for attraction, which invariably leads to ultimate dissatisfaction, instability, and finally dissolution of such relationships because they were anchored all along within the alien Eurocentric framework. Whether African men are able to recognize it or not, long hair is the accepted standard of beauty in females, although they may vary greatly in other attributes. Additionally, both African males and females in general tend to view persons as more attractive the less the stereotyped African facial characteristics they present. Stereotype meaning as defined by the institutionalized processes of white supremacy social order, in other words, mass media. Africans also tend to employ the view that the less stereotyped African behavior one displays, the more attractive and desirable one is perceived. In short, under conditions of psychological cultural misorientation, the more prototypical European Eurocentric one is perceived to be, both physically and behaviorally, the more normative, normal, acceptable one is perceived by oneself and others. I strongly suspect that there is probably a strong and perhaps deeply unconscious connection between the variety of ingenious ways that culturally misoriented Africans impose Eurocentric social rejection criteria on each other, from skin complexion and physical facial features and other bodily characteristics like nose shapes, eyes, color, hair texture, head shapes, etc., to even more obscure aspects of the person like speech patterns, where a person is from their hometown, their neighborhood, city, and or region, and resulting psychopathological conditions like suicide, drug addiction, some expressions of rape, violence in relationships, criminal behavioral patterns, and perhaps even some homosexual tendencies among African people. We get all of that crap from white folks. African cultural centered approaches to African mental health, of course, will ultimately clarify the validity of these kinds of hypotheses. One other pervasive everyday form of psychological cultural misorientation among Africans in America, as well as in Africa, occurs in the areas of religious expression, or what Azibo calls theological misorientation. This, too, is a very dangerous form of African psychopathology because it is regarded as natural, normal, and healthy for Africans, and it also enjoys the protective privilege of sacrosanct status, or being beyond or not amendable to critical Afrocentric analysis. In our liberation struggle, however, if it is to be truly victorious, and it must be undebatably so, then nothing among us can enjoy such a privilege except our racial, cultural integrity, and even that must be studied and understood. African religious practices under the influence of Eurasian supremacy, oppression, and domination systems represent very dangerous mental health phenomena for African people. Such cultural misoriented practices are literally killing us, in fact, because they are defined and controlled by such systems. One of the many great contradictions in them are the various names that we use for the creator, the creative force, and its attributes derived from the foreign alien cultures which invented or modified what they stole from us and controlled these religions, such as Christianity and the Christ, Jesus, Jehovah, Islam and Allah, Judaism and Yahweh, etc. All of these are non-indigenous African words, non-African languages, not related to an indigenous African ethnic cultural group's language form. And these deities are also non-African forms. Our African ancestors, the very first humans on the planet, developed an understanding of the Creator, systems of communicating with the Creator, and thus names for the Creator based on our uniquely special and intimate and long historical experience with the Creator. Thus, our traditional African names for the Creator, its aspects, and our traditional systems of communication with the Creator, forces of the universe, endured, obviously based on their accuracy and effectiveness for thousands and thousands of years, long before we had evidence of the existence of a European, Aryan, or Semitic race like Persians, Arabs, or Asians in civilized societies. No other belief system in the world have the longevity, durability, and track record of the African system. Religious spiritual systems are created out of or in response to the unique and indigenous needs and character of the culture in which they occur. They are created to work and for and enhance the culture. African spiritual systems have that purpose for African people. European religious systems, such as Christianity, have that purpose for Europeans, and Arab religious systems, such as Islam, have that purpose for Arabs. They project the cultural reality of the indigenous group's experience out of which they evolved or were reformulated. That is clearly natural, the natural order of things. Religious systems, then, are cultural defined phenomena. They are not universal, standing outside of and transcending cultural reality. In the misorientation of our cultural oppression victimization to these foreign and anti African religious systems, we can only maintain a partial allegiance, whatever that means, to our Africanity, to our race, cultural survival thrust, not a singular total allegiance, as should be the case. Even that tenuous alliance only holds as long as it does not conflict with our allegiance to the foreign anti African cultural system. When in this state of cultural misorientation are we able to develop this peculiar partial African allegiance? It creates in us a false sense belief in our achievement of personal liberation from Eurocentric and Arab-centric mental enslavement, in our presumed clarity of vision, but knowing our enemy. But the bottom line again is that these foreign anti-African systems prevent we victimized Africans from developing a singular total commitment and allegiance to our African cultural sovereignty. Why do we then, as contemporary Africans, form and maintain these unbelievable religious mental-cidal allegiances to and intoxications with these foreign cultural belief systems, rather than return to our very own authentic, time-tested African spiritual systems? Even if some of the basic principles in the alien religions may be indigenous to African culture, and if some individual Africans participated in their formation, these religious systems did not originate from or evolve out of the collective, cumulative, traditional African experience. Therefore, They do not, in my view, address the true African spirituality. In the madness of our ahistorical cultural misorientation, we literally jump into the religious cultural bed with our former slave masters, the brutalizers and destroyers of African life, and those who historically have and continue to disrespect African life in the most fundamental ways. Most of us have had their cultural names forced on us, both Christian, European, Muslim, and Arab names. Through their brutal oppressive systems, conquest, and physical enslavement. The pervasiveness of our non-African names, then, cannot be overlooked in a reasonably thorough analysis of African mental health. In the diaspora, in particular, we Africans proudly and unashamedly refer to ourselves by the names of our former slave masters in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the so-called New World or New Europe. Thus, a true measure of African mental health, I believe, lies in the fact that we victims of Euro-Asian supremacy have maintained the names of those who murdered and enslaved our ancestors and who disrespected African life in the most brutal ways. We apparently experience no sense of contradiction in our engaging in such a grossly anti-African practice. As previously noted, growing numbers of us even reject the names of one former slave master, brutalizer of African life, for very good and sound reasons, and then, in a most peculiar manner, trade them in for another slave master's, brutalizer and destroyer of African life name. What he's talking about is how the Black Muslim will go select an Arab name when to this day Arabs are still enslaving Black people. Names, hence, we now voluntarily and proudly adopt these alien cultural names, such as African Muslims in America, while menticidally advocating it as a culturally liberating act. It is as if some of us Africans have become so victimized that we engage in a strange kind of slave master hopping or shopping practice rather than seeking to reclaim our Africanity. Again, these acts are the direct result of our miseducation and the breakdown of our essential African cultural infrastructure. And all of us, so-called Christian and Muslims alike, passionately continue this highly dangerous cultural misorientation tradition generation after generation. Thus, we still refuse, in our seeming madness, to return to our African traditions, the indigenous cultural names of our ancestors, which were good enough for our people for thousands of years when we ruled the world and made great achievements for humanity. In our cultural misorientation resulting from our Eurocentric, Arab-centric miseducation, we psychologically incarcerated Africans, or again, to use Azibo's concept, we theologically misoriented Africans of so-called modern world will usually fight, kill, and die for these foreign, alien, anti-African cultures which have brutally and savagely destroyed our people and have obviously destroyed our African cultural mentalities and allegiances as well. We have indeed accepted and adopted the reality of the enslavers, destroyers of African civilization, the brutalizers of African life, and severed our sacred obligations and responsibilities to our ancestors. Our ancestors courageously fought back against these barbaric destroyers of African life, and we, their descendants, have and continue to shamefully dishonor them, our African cultural sovereignty, by forming these intimate associations with religious belief systems and cultural structures of the enemies of our ancestors, the enemies of African people, hence our own enemies. In short, then, the imposition of the European worldview on African reality in America in particular has been most pervasive throughout all areas of so-called African American life. Through its powerful institutional tentacles, it pervades and dominates African educational life in America, African religious life in America, African economic life in America, African aesthetic expressions in America, African politics in America, African family, community, and social life in America, and obviously African psychological life and physical survival in general in America. While the immediate focus on the cultural misorientation in America, note that all of these situations are applicable to the world situation of Africans, including, most importantly, in Africa itself. To complete this presentation of illustrations of African cultural misorientation, following are some examples, some of which have already been discussed, taken from an earlier analysis of this problem. Some major areas of African American societal activity which manifest cultural misorientation. I have begun to refrain from using the term African American in my more recent writing because I find its meaning to be very questionable within the context of Afrocentric analysis. I seriously question whether such an entity as an African American can really exist. In a cultural sense, I believe not. Nonetheless, I will use it here in these subheadings temporarily, as ambiguous as it is, for the sake of reinforcing context, specificity, and familiarity. However, in its use, I merely mean Africans in America and nothing more. So here are his tenets of what Africans in America go through and how we need to, and I will talk more about how we need to reverse it. African American education. Africans in America depend on Europeans for their education and accept white supremacy Eurocentrism as a philosophical core of every educational discipline, which results in miseducation and anti-African orientation among Africans in America. Therefore, the knowledge base and skill development of Africans in America promote white supremacy and Eurocentrism, and independent African-centered institutions are few in existence, unpopular, and poorly supported. He's saying that we need our own schools. We need our own systems. We need our own institutions of higher learning. African American religion. Africans in America accept and practice white supremacy Eurocentrism as the core of their religious beliefs and activities, be they Christians, Jewish, or Muslim, or some other non-African form. Therefore, non-African cultural values, icons, labels, languages, etc., predominate in the religious belief systems, practices, and rituals of Africans in America. We need to go back to an African-centered religious system. Now, that's difficult because we have been despiritualized, and a lot of us say there's nothing out there. A lot of us worship nothing. But we have to revere our ancestors. We can start there, and we can start cleansing the Bible, because that is, or the Quran if you prefer. But those are the primary books for, as my mother would say, the believer's instructions before leaving earth. And you have to meditate on and decode it within yourself so that you can get the meaning for your family out of that particular book or out of those books. But any book can be a reference tool for you to start your spiritual journey on. Dr. Josephine Yakinen says all religions started in Africa and they all stole something from us. So any form of worship, whether it's hoodoo, voodoo, Yudu, Christianity, whatever it is that you want to practice, then you practice that spiritual system. But it starts with a reverence and understanding of your ancestors and where they came from, so that you can slowly go back. Because just jumping into an African religion might shock your mind. It might literally shock your mind. And I don't want anyone losing it because they have jumped into an African spiritual tradition that they don't understand. You got to remember that Stevie Wonder song, Superstition. Very superstitious, writings on the wall. When you believe in things that you don't understand, superstition ain't the way. Okay? African American economics. Africans in America accept and practice white supremacy, Eurocentrism throughout their economic and business activities. Thus, the consumer dependency orientation as opposed to the producer owner orientation and the dominant practice of spending money outside of their own community and group dominate African economic practices in America. Brother Bakari talks a lot about this. He talks about spending money with your own people. And I think that at the point that we decide to stop being mass consumers of Arab, Indian, Asian, white people stuff, that we will get a little bit further ahead. But you have to also check the consciousness of the people that you're spending money with. And unfortunately, some of us are in positions where we are at subsistence living, and we can't stop paying our rent to a Jewish landlord because they own the land. Do you know what I'm saying? We can't stop paying our mortgage to a white mortgage servicer because we bought our house through a finance company. So, you have to evaluate where you are, and then slowly but surely begin to integrate African producers, African owners, African-centered people into your economy, so that you'll know that you are at least participating in a pro-African economic system. You can also see if susus will work for you, where groups of people come together and everybody monthly puts in $25, $10, $5. You can start with $5 a week, and you go around and everybody gets the money from the pot. And I would recommend not doing more than 12 people, because there are 12 months in a year. And the objective is for you to get the money 1 month of the year, so that people feel like they have participated in and they all get their opportunity to benefit from the susu. So that's another suggestion. You can also get to the point where you make something. Like I do things here. I make t-shirts. I cleanse things spiritually. So I resell a lot of things that have been processed and taken through a process. So there are things that I do where I make stuff. So if you make stuff, let us know what stuff you make so that we can support your business. Okay. African American media. Africans in America accept white supremacy, Eurocentric, anti-African reality and imagery projected through their media by depending upon it for African affirmation, by overwhelmingly patronizing European media, and by perpetuating it in our own media as well. So, what he's saying is that we consume white media in large part. And when we consume that white media, we're taking in their imagery and their ideology, not only of us, but the images they have of themselves. And because we don't go get the raw data, and a lot of times we don't have the ability to go get the raw data, we take that information into an African system and we don't even Africanize it. We just re-report it. So one of the things that's good about social media is that you're getting another lens, you're getting another view of the news. We're getting another view of the news through an African-centered lens. And that is what's good. Forecast says that the group we were trying to create was the purpose, but you're right, we should have limited it to 12 people. He said that he had this thing, the birthday challenge, where everyone in the group gives the birthday person $5 or something like that. That's an excellent way to start. That's also an excellent way to start building trust within a community, because a lot of Black communities suffer from a lack of emotional safety and trust. You know, we have been so abused by this system of white supremacy that we are taught not to trust one another. And that is a really good way to build emotional safety and trust, to start with something small, something that you can walk away from if it all goes wrong. And once you get to the point where it's like, oh, I can walk away from this if it all goes wrong, then you can begin to build trust with larger amounts of money or with other types of mediums of exchange. But you have to get to the point where you are building emotional safety and trust within your community. But again, going back to the media thing, it's not just having a Black woman in the media that reads the news to you. Is she giving you an African-centered perspective of the news, similar to some of the YouTube personalities that give you another perspective of the news? They don't do every story, but that is an interesting place to start. If you would like my hot takes on the news, leave me a comment and let me know. I might do something like that. But what we do on Shoot the Breeze, what Koku does on Shoot the Breeze, what Forecast does every Wednesday with Cassandra Cheek, they are taking the news and giving you an African-centered perspective of the news. Sometimes even Kofi does that. African-American cultural icons, images, and symbolism. Africans in America accept and utilize white supremacy, Eurocentric, anti-African images and symbols as their very own. Therefore, Eurocentric images and symbols are pervasive throughout the African community in America. In other words, on our person, in our homes and churches, in our schools and businesses, our recreation and entertainment, and in our thoughts and ideas. Their names and physical characteristics also dominate our personal self-imagery definition. Now, one of the things that you have to do with the images that you put up in your home, you definitely have to take time to Africanize them. Because if you got RFK, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Barack Obama on your wall, that's great. But why is Kennedy there? Why aren't you putting images of strong Africans on your walls? Why are you taking into your heart and into your mind every day an image of a white man? You know, you have to get to the point where in your schools and in your churches, at your places of business, the entertainment, the movies that you watch, the books that you read are African-centered and are rooted in Afrocentrism, because if they are not, those small petty images of white people in positions of power or white people being revered as ancestors are going to take you to a place mentally that is unhealthy for you. So it is good for the esteem of a white kid to see all of these white icons, but it's good for a black kid to see all these black icons as well. African American political activity. Africans in America accept and utilize white supremacy, Eurocentric, and anti Africanness in all conventional methods and strategies and actions geared towards social group racial empowerment. The political priorities and objectives or goals of Africans in America are therefore Eurocentric in nature rather than Afrocentric, prioritizing achieving social racial integration with Europeans and access to European institutions and resources, over developing African independence, institutions, and self determination. He's saying that we want to integrate our institution. We want to be integrated into white institutions instead of actually building our own institutions. This goes back to the first thing he said, well, we need our own schools. If we took the time to build our own institutions and political thought and political activity, we change things. But we have to invest in someone in our community, right? Because all politics are local. So we have to invest in someone in our community, preferably a young person, that can take over political positions in our community that has an African-centered perspective. And then them with their African-centered perspective sitting on a school board or a city council board have the backing of the community that's willing to riot, because you can't just be in a place of political importance. You can't just have a black face in a high place without any backing in the community, right? So you have to have people willing to riot. That's why Malcolm X was such a threat, as demonstrated by Spike Lee when he had the Nation of Islam come out and stood there. And then when he moved his hand and the brothers started marching off, and he said, that's too much power for one black man to have. Well, that is what's necessary. So it has to be both in a political position with a black consciousness and the support of a strong community that will come out and riot for you. The forecast says, yes, you would definitely when you have time. Oh, I should definitely come on. He wants to know my opinion on some of those topics. Absolutely. Absolutely. African American social activity. Africans in America accept and utilize white supremacy and Eurocentric values, images, and definitions, anti-Africanness in relating to each other, and by requiring European acknowledgement and recognition, involvement and participation, approval and legitimacy in all areas of life, and by ascribing deity-like status to those who are successful in obtaining it. So in our social activities, right, we deify white people. I think we are uniquely fascinated with white people, and I think that they're fascinated with us. The difference is that we were put in a position of subjugation to them, and because we were enslaved by them, we have been epigenetically changed to see them as God, because that's the only image of God we were allowed to have. We couldn't hold on to our petty little fetishes and our images of our family members in the past, but now we can. Okay, now we can. And we are always seeking white acceptance. We are always seeking acceptance from them. And we have to get to a point where their acceptance doesn't matter because they're not going to accept us anyway. They're not. They're not going to acknowledge our greatness and our beauty. They will just be fascinated with us and copy our culture and go take it and monetize it. That's what they do with us. They consume us like a product because they slip on and slip off aspects of Blackness in an attempt to be cool or to be culture vultures. And the reality is that we should not look for their acceptance in this area of life, but we do because it's what we've been taught to do. It's what unfortunately we were told to do. It was beat into us. And in the process of re-Africanizing yourself, you have to get to the point where you stare that white man down in his face and you say, it doesn't matter what you think about me. This is what's important to me. My family is important to me. Me being able to gain a skill that I can market in the larger marketplace on my own is what's important to me. Me being able to practice my own spirituality and cultural practices is what's important to me. Okay? So these types of things are the things that we have to get to the point where we are saying them, where white affirmation and white acceptance and approval and legitimacy does not have any importance to us because they don't care about the things that we're doing. They only coming over here to see what they can plunder. They only coming over here to see what they can plunder, period, point blank. All of the examples discussed here, as well as those discussed earlier, are unquestionably among some of the most insidious forms of psychological cultural misorientation that the African personality must reckon with if we are to ever recover from Eurocentric anti-African encroachment against our African psychological cultural sovereignty. Only time will tell. But it is the position of this analysis that only through the recovery of our African cultural senses will we be able to transcend this basic condition of African psychopathology called psychological cultural misorientation. Distribution of psychological cultural misorientation among Africans in America. One way to appreciate the dangerous prevalence of psychological cultural misorientation among Africans in America would be to project hypothetical normal distribution of this phenomenon based on the position of this analysis. As can be seen in the illustration, which looks like a small hill starting at 0%, going all the way up to a midpoint of 50% and then coming all the way down, the vast majority, 70 to 80% of the African population in America are hypothesized to be afflicted at the moderate or level or range of this disorder, while as many as 10%, if not more, are probably severely afflicted, with at least some 10% may only be minorly afflicted. What this distribution suggests then is that most African people living under white supremacy domination may indeed suffer from moderate to severe forms of psychological cultural misorientation. This is most certainly an issue of Afrocentric preventative intervention models must take into consideration if they are to be effective in setting their goals and objectives from the Afrocentric perspective. Thus, the utility of the ASEO, or African Self-Consciousness Model, of conceptualizing African mental health is clearly supported by the mass data all around us. It provides a basis for explaining most, if not all, of the basic psychopathologies manifested by African people in our struggle to recover from our more than 2,000 seasons of relentless Eurocentric encroachment and cultural domination. It also demonstrates the psychological cultural misorientation poses one of the greatest threats, if not the greatest threat, to African mental health throughout the world. Conclusion. In the final analysis, of course, this model also attempts to demonstrate that under sociocultural conditions of white supremacy rule and domination over African people, virtually all behavior and actions not only have major mental health significance, but also have significant political import for African people, either strengthening or weakening African empowerment, African self determination, African affirmation, etc. This must not be overlooked in psychological analysis of the African personality under conditions such as those characterizing the American as well as the diasporan context. Thus, whether it is our religious practices, systems of expressions, our naming ourselves, our hair preparation and physical representation, our clothing, our economic and political practices, or our entertainment and recreational preferences and activities, it must be defined and practiced from an African cultural centered framework if it is to reinforce our African survival thrust and thus reflect positive, optimal mental health in the African personality. Where the issue of African mental health is concerned specifically, it has been said that for African people, our psychological spiritual health, our energy, and our strength comes from our cultural foundation, our cultural rituals, customs, and practices which symbolize and reaffirm our ancestral linkages. Thus, the weakening of our psychological spiritual health occurs in our movement away from African cultural foundation, our African cultural values, rituals, and customs. Hence, African mental health depends on our closeness to or continuity of that which we as Africans maintain to our cultural origins, to our ancestors, through our practice of traditional values and rituals. African self consciousness, therefore, represents the natural disposition of the African personality, which allows African people to consciously value and participate in African self affirmation, the African worldview, through the practice of African cultural centered customs, rituals, and practices, perhaps modified for our contemporary circumstances. The full recovery of the African personality victimized by European supremacy domination requires a massive dosage of African cultural renewal. This will necessarily entail the rebuilding of our African cultural infrastructure throughout the diaspora. So, as you can see, it is necessary and imperative for us to take on the responsibility of not despiritualizing ourselves, but to take on the responsibility of actually sitting in and reaffirming those African cultural beliefs. And unfortunately, for many of us, it starts with Christianity, but it doesn't have to start with white Jesus. It doesn't have to start with white Jesus. It starts with taking some time to evaluate and assess the many pieces of information that you remember, or if you can talk to an ancestor, the different practices that they had, the different oils and herbs that they took in, why they took them in, and then learning what those herbs and roots do. Every plant, every oil has a spiritual meaning. Okay. Every color has a spiritual meaning. Heck, talk to Chat GPT about it and say, hey, what significance does color X have in Black spirituality? And it'll tell you. Take some time to get to know what the ancestors practiced, and take some time to get to know yourself. Because only by doing those things that connect you back to your African self are you going to be able to find your way through this maze of white supremacy domination and connect with your people. Do you understand? Only by finding your way through this maze of disconnectedness are you going to be able to connect with and find the people that you're supposed to find. I'm still searching for I'm still searching for different aspects of my family's spirituality, but I have my altar built. I have my power colors. I have my oils and my herbs. And so I have the things that are necessary to begin the journey. And for me, it started with a Bible, you know? So you just have to get to the point where you're willing and able to connect. All right, guys. That is all I have to say for tonight. I will be back tomorrow night. We're going to start our Amos Wilson secondary readings, The Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy. I want to thank Anthony McPhail, The Forecast, Sister Raw, and everyone else that's listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. I know that Koku is listening. I know that Oni Tase is listening. I know that Sister Ra and the elders are listening. I thank you so much for the appreciation that you send me. I know that Afro Native World is listening, and so many others. I value each and every one of you and the contributions that you give to this stream. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Peace, guys.